thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to the virtual Huntington Library for the inaugural programme in the Kathleen Peck Victorian Studies series. In this case, a lecture given by Professor Priya Satia of Stanford University. I'm delighted to say that this evening's programme is made possible through the extraordinary generosity of Kathleen Peck, who in her capacity as an active scholar in the Huntington's reading rooms and as a member of the Society of Fellows has been a consistently supportive individual in respect of the Huntington's research programmes. Kathleen's ambition is to create and sustain a new programme that will draw on the Huntington's rich 19th century collections in the Art Museum, the library and the gardens to promote knowledge amongst a much larger public audience of the significance of the Victorians and their times. Tonight's programme was originally planned for June the 9th, 2020, exactly a year ago, which happened to be the occasion of Kathleen's birthday, and a significant birthday at that. We were delighted that Priya Satia agreed to give the talk, not only because of her expertise in 19th century British imperial history, but also because, in a remarkable coincidence, June the 9th happens to be her birthday also. Then the pandemic intervened and forced us to postpone, and we thought it best to rearrange for the same date in 2021. And here we are a year later with the opportunity to wish both Kathleen and Priya the happiest of birthdays. I am accordingly delighted to introduce Priya Satia, who is Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History at Stanford University. She holds her first degrees in Chemistry and International Studies from Stanford, her MSc in Developmental Economics from the London School of Economics, and her PhD in History from UC Berkeley. Her first book, Spies in Arabia, The Great War and the Cultural Foundations of Britain's Covert Empire in the Middle East, appeared in 2008 and won several awards, including the American Historical Association's Herbert Baxter Adams Book Prize. Her second book, Empire of Guns, The Violent Making of the Industrial Revolution, was also garlanded, winning another prize from the AHA. Her third book, Time's Monster, How History Makes History, appeared last year and focuses on the role of modern historical imagination in the history of the British Empire. So to discuss conscience and Victorian Empire, how history helped make history in British India, please welcome me in joining the Kathleen Peck lecturer, Professor Priya Satia.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I hope you all can hear me all right. And I have to apologize, first of all, I have a slightly hoarse voice because I'm getting over a cold. So I apologize for that. And of course, first of all, happy birthday to Kathleen and cheers. And I'm glad we were able to hold this event. You know, it's now 2 years in the making. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this talk with you and taking your questions afterwards. So I'll go ahead and start, and I'll be showing some slides in a few minutes, but we'll just start this way. So what I want to talk about today is the role of the discipline of history in the actual making of the history of the British Empire. So how history emerged in the modern period as a kind of system of ethical thought that wound up guiding the exercise of British agency in making empire. So in the talk, we'll first look briefly at the emergence of historical thinking as that kind of ethical idiom during the Enlightenment period, so before the Victorian period. But then we'll really focus on the role of that new historical ethical idiom in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and the way the memory of that rebellion of 1857 then wound up driving efforts to remake the historical disciplines, ethical commitments and orientation as we get closer to our time. So let me explain what I mean by ethical systems. So we have access to multiple systems of ethical thought in our lives. We have inherited religious ethics, ethics drawn from mythologies, different philosophical systems, community ways of thinking. And we have all those still with us, but we have another one too, which was kind of an inheritance from the Enlightenment. And this is the idea that historical narratives can guide the moral exercise of human agency. So before the Enlightenment, history was really understood as just a sort of story or a narrative of events, a kind of chronicle of events. And what you see happening is in the middle of the 18th century, expectations of what a historical narrative is supposed to offer start to shift. Excuse me. So let me just show you how this happens. So in 1735, this Tory politician and man of letters named Lord Bolingbroke writes an essay on the use of history. And there are lots of pamphlets and books with that kind of title in this period. They're trying to figure out what is the use of history. So this essay was finally published in 1752. And in it, excuse me, Bolingbroke urges a philosophical approach to the study of history with the aim of discerning general principles that are going to be true across time, and thus that will form, quote, a general system of ethics and politics on the surest foundations. So now another example, you look at Adam Smith, a very important Enlightenment thinker, who wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments in the 18th century. And he kept revising it over the second half of the century. And in the early version of this text, closer to the middle of the century, he stressed the importance of a kind of internal eye in moral judgment. So it's sort of like you're watching yourself with an internal eye, and that's how you cultivate moral sentiments. But by the end of the 18th century, that his analysis has changed. He instead is talking more about a historical outlook, that an individual learns how to judge himself, how to discern whether they're, whether he is, it is really he's talking about young men at this time, whether he is behaving ethically by first judging people in the past. So you read history, you judge people in the past, and they become your moral examples. So cultivating moral sentiments was all about historical observation for Smith by the end of the century. And another example, in 1784, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant writes another philosophy of, what is history for? And it's called The Idea for a Universal History. And his purpose in writing it is, he explicitly says that my purpose is to help direct the way history actually unfolds. So he's trying to get people to read this, to especially political figures, in his time, to read this and then change the way they act in light of what they learned from this. So the idea is that they will now learn to act in light of the example of great figures in the past, and then with an eye towards history's future judgment of them. It's sort of like how Washington tells Hamilton in the Hamilton musical, history has its eyes on you. This is the lesson that Kant is trying to tell political figures in his own time. And his idea is that, by purveying this lesson, he's going to help enable the fulfillment of the ideal universal history that he hopes is going to unfold on Earth, which he hopes is going to be a story of progress that's going to culminate in the creation of a peaceful cosmopolitan global federation. That's where history is headed in his mind. And so this is a new view of history, but it's not exactly secular. So none of these philosophers are saying that God is going to actively intervene in human events, as they do in sort of Greek myth, right? But they are saying that history is going to unfold according to a providential plan, some kind of divine plan. And this idea was really important to help in helping Enlightenment philosophers make sense of why a good God permits evil in the world. That was their fundamental question. How can we believe history is heading towards progress? Because look at all the horrible things that happen all the time. And what they decided was that in time, things that seem evil to us now maybe will be revealed to have been necessary to the fulfillment of some redemptive providential plan. Like it's all going to turn out right in the end. And so we should tolerate things that seem evil now. So for Kant, without that reassurance that things will turn out well in time, the kind of malice and folly and idiocy that so obviously seemed to guide how humans behaved would drive us to look for meaning only in the afterlife. We would just think human existence on this earth has no purpose, right? The only purpose and meaning we can find will be when we are no longer on this earth, you know, in the afterlife. So he said, we may not be able to see the way reason is influencing the unfolding of any individual life within the span of their life, but we will be able to see reason's operation in humankind's long run evolution. History is going to reveal that. So for the Enlightenment's worldly hopes for meaning to be accessible in this world, they had to believe that history was providential, that they're basically necessary evils. Now in England, and this is where I want to start sharing some pictures with you. Okay, so now there's, this is another Enlightenment philosopher who lived in Birmingham in England. And he was also a scientist, historian of science, a clergyman, Joseph Priestling. Now he also wrote on the purposes, history's purpose, soon after Kant did. And at the start of his book, he quotes Lord Bolingbroke. So they are like all aware of what one another are saying. And he writes in this book that he's certain that the study of history must have an effect that is favorable to virtue, because all evils lead to and terminate in a greater good. So very similar to what Kant says. And he says that great events, this is the part underlined here, great progressive events are, quote, brought about contrary to the intention of the persons who were the chief instruments of them and by the very means which were intended to produce a contrary event. So there's a kind of prototypical dialectical imagination here in which evil is understood to have a kind of productive or constructive role over time as part of a story of continual improvement. So because history is guided by God, by providence, it has to be a story of progress. So he advises in this book, when a historian or someone studying, a student, you know, of history can't perceive God's benevolent tendency, let him remain in suspense with regard to them. Like, don't just assume that God isn't there or that something evil is happening, you know, against God's will. Just wait and see, right? So the historian must rest assured that the judgment of time would ultimately endorse the ethical superiority of whatever transpired, even if in the initial appearance of it, it might seem evil, right? So he ends the book with these words: he advised readers to follow the, quote, plain duties of morality, like ordinary everyday ethics, but also at the same time, acquiesce in the divine conduct that might at first alarm our narrow apprehensions. So there's a kind of idea here that expect God to be cunning, like the cunning of God. Expect that, you know, he moves in mysterious ways, really. So these philosophers were writing about history and its uses and purposes during a period in which scandals were constantly erupting about Britain's loot-driven violent conquest of South Asia, especially, which culminated in this spectacular 8-year impeachment trial of the Governor General of India, whose name was Warren Hastings. So that's happening in the background. The abolition movement also is taking off. Slave trade is also a moral scandal. So Britons are concluding from these scandals and this new understanding of history that their empire is going to have to fulfill a higher purpose going forward to redeem those immoral origins, you know, when it was really just about loot earlier in the 18th century. So what you see happening in the early 19th century is that imperial expansion goes on, but it's partly driven by a desire to atone for earlier imperial sins. And it relied on a historical imagination in which the British were the sort of selfless bearers of progress around the world, and they're trying to make up for mistakes they had made in the 18th century. So, and in this vision, great men especially were understood to be essential to fulfilling that universal providential history. And great men included the great historians who were going to have, you know, who have the genius to sort of interpret this history as it's unfolding. This was the message of a very popular book by Thomas Carlyle in 1841. This is a later edition I'm showing you here, which said that history is, quote, but history is but the biography of great men. I'm sure many of you may have heard this phrase. And these were men, great men were men who at times had to rise above ordinary ethics and morals to fulfill Providence's goals for earthly existence. Now, according to one of Carlyle's contemporaries, one of the period's most influential historians and a really important imperial policymaker, Thomas Macaulay, progress meant turning colonial subjects into Englishmen. British rule was Providence itself. It was the handmaiden of history all around the world. It was uplifting degraded civilizations and making them in the British image. So he reframed the kind of sordid history of 18th century conquest of places like parts of India as the fault of nature or of deceitful Indians. It's not Britain's fault. And he said instead that Britons should be proud of their national past. And this is what he urged in his very, very popular work called The History of England, which was a multi-volume book that came out in the middle of the 19th century. And he writes in there, a people which takes no pride in the noble achievements of remote ancestors will never achieve anything worthy to be remembered with pride by remote descendants. So he says, he's basically striving to instill pride in the nation's past, specifically for the practical purpose of informing the way his people make history in their own time, and especially history in the empire. So for sure, there was always dissent against views like Macaulay's, against views like Carlyle's and so on, both in Britain and all around the world and in the colonies that Britain is starting to rule. You can think of the Romantic thinkers as sort of one set of critics. And there was also continual resistance to this imposition of this British vision of what progress and civilization should look like. And this is where I want to talk about the Indian Rebellion of 1857. So here are just two maps to show you kind of a snapshot of the British presence, the pink color in India. I'm just saying India, but South Asia really, from 1785. And then the second one is much more pink, you can see in 1857. So this rebellion was massive. It was really a war. It's sometimes called the mutiny, but it is because it started with a mutiny within the British Indian Army, but it becomes a massive warlike event that takes a whole year for the British to suppress. And it puts a major dent in this kind of confident liberal vision that Macaulay was expressing. It's a massive uprising across different classes, across different regions. It's a war against British power that the British struggle to put down for a year, and they resort to quite barbarous tactics to do so. Now, the British thought of Indians as sort of passive and lacking a sense of history. That's why they need the British to make history happen for them, right? And so when this rebellion emerges, they're quite shocked and taken aback, and they put it down to, well, it can't be Indians having a sense of history because they don't have that. That's their assumption, their kind of racial or cultural assumptions. So they instead say, okay, Indians are acting out of religious fanaticism. Okay, they have religious belief that's beyond reason. And that actually just proved how much they needed Britain's help in recognizing the value of progress and what progress really looks like. Now, it is true that Indians who were rebelling did talk about the need to defend the Muslim faith or the Hindu faith on pain of damnation. The rhetoric coming out of the rebellion was along those lines. But they also talked about patriotic allegiance. They talked about dynastic allegiances. They talked about injustice. Their rebel proclamations would routinely recount the history of British treachery and perfidies. And it's not a coincidence that they rebelled in 1857, which was the centenary of an event called the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which was the battle in which the British really established their first major territorial foothold in the subcontinent. And so there's a historical consciousness then at work among the rebels in rebelling exactly on that centenary. So you see religious ideas of the Day of Judgment, right? Fusing with a sense of, a time of historical reckoning on this centenary. Now, the official head of the rebellion was the aging Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who I'll show you a picture of him shortly. And the British had sort of made him into a pensioner. He was, paid a pension at this point. And he also felt he was at a kind of historic endgame. The British had made it clear that he would be the last Mughal ruler to live at the Red Fort in Delhi. And so he also, in his actions, was sort of staking a claim for posterity. Accounts of divine retribution that the rebels articulated relied on a strongly historical sensibility. So one newspaper that was influential in Delhi at this time was called the Delhi Urdu Akhbar. And it was a kind of propaganda instrument during the rebellion. And so drawing on some of its rhetoric, you can see the way historical sensibility and religious ideas really merged. So it said, for instance, that there's proof in the fact that formidable oppressive rulers can be overthrown in the fact that, quote, nothing is permanent except God. So in the newspaper, it says, many magnificent dynasties and kingdoms in the land of Hindustan, or India, all met their end. And so the newspaper called on Indians to emulate heroes from history books and ancient Indian history or Islamic history and Mughal history, not very different from, Macaulay's injunctions about emulating heroes in the past, in order to feel inspired to act heroically in your own time. And the newspaper said that God will help them, the rebels, defeat this British kingdom, which, quote, regarded the children of God with contempt and addressed your brothers and brethren as black men and thus insulted and humiliated them. And the paper went on to refer to unjust laws, the rise of English language, the drain of Indian wealth, exclusion of Indians from government posts, dispossession of ancestral property, and so on and so on. So the rebellion basically was refusing the modernizing uniformity that the British are trying to impose in the name of progress. And instead, the rebels are defending what the historian Faisal Devji calls, quote, an empire of distinctions in which differences between rulers and subjects, as well as among these subjects, were desired because they made morality possible in the form of obligation towards others. They defended the moral compact forged through coexistence with the alien, rather than through reformation of the alien, which was more the British approach. So where Enlightenment philosophers were looking to the future to explain the existence of evil in the present, many South Asian philosophical traditions in the same time expected contradiction in all times. They expected evil and good to coexist, always. They expect that, the God who loves us is also our tormentor. He is the source of misery and he is the source of solace. Now, the Urdu word for the rebellion in 1857, it was called Gadar. And that word means mutiny, but it also means simply disorder or turmoil or turbulence. So this was a disorder. This was a kind of undoing of empire, when history still for that whole year remained undecided as to whether the rebels were going to win and whether they were traitors to the righteous British cause, or were they the vanguard of a righteous Indian cause. So this was a time when the outcome was unknown. It was a time that was itself a time of contradiction, and the internal tension of that turmoil was a motivator of historical change. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So a lot of Britons at first saw this rebellion as proof of British misgovernment. They were very empathetic and they worried about reports of torture that were coming in. They worried about these rapacious annexations of more and more Indian territory. They were calling for reform initially, but that empathetic view was displaced very soon as these racist accounts of Indian atrocities started to circulate in the new mass press of the Victorian period that included often these mythical stories of, British children being impaled and these, heroic tales of British commanders defending white women and children against these, devilish, demonic Indian rebels. So Indian motives sort of ceased to be seen as political and were instead viewed as purely criminal or diabolical. And instead of reform, the British public started to call for ruthless suppression of the revolt and reimposition of British rule. So this is a cartoon in the Punch magazine a few months into this rebellion. With this call for revenge, the British destroyed entire cities and burned hundreds of villages and hanged and shot and blew rebels from the mouths of cannons in thousands. Here's one engraving of that kind of punishment. And here, I'm sorry for the violence of the image, but this is a photograph actually from that period, taken by an Italian photographer. The Emperor Zephyr, his sons and grandson were shot in front of a crowd as kind of a theatrical punishment. Zephyr himself, who's pictured here, was exiled to Rangoon, and he died there a few years later. Now, the costs of this violence, putting down this rebellion, about 50 million pounds were then added to India's debts to England. So Indians are going to have to, as taxpayers, pay for the cost of putting down the rebellion. So British violence was also religious, emerging from an ethic of Christian vengeance, whose harsh capacities were sort of sublimated in the gospel of progress and improvement. So military leaders of the conflict, great heroes of the conflict, like Sir Henry Havelock, for instance, had a very intense, very popular evangelical kind of aura to them. This is a statue of him that still stands in Trafalgar Square. Now, this evangelical ethos elevated retribution, this political retribution, into something nobler than just revenge. It was a kind of visitation of righteous judgment, almost divine judgment, preemptively fulfilling the work of a history that they knew to be unfolding providentially. So the idea that the entire empire's security was somehow at stake in how they handled this rebellion was an argument for reestablishing British control through terror if necessary. And that's why you see collective punishments, the burning of entire villages, and spectacular violence like those theatrical punishments. And those were for the sake of the British public and also the Indian public, and also for colonial subjects all around the empire, so that no one would think of engaging in this kind of rebellion again. So it's for the sake of saving history and the providential direction they knew the empire was enabling it to unfold. So a sense of the historical stakes of this rebellion and the crushing of it helped assuage moral qualms that Britons genuinely had about the kind of violence they resorted to in putting it down. Now, the immediacy of historical events, historical assessments after the rebellion really testified to the growing awareness of the importance of controlling the historical narrative to controlling the unfolding of history itself. The philosopher John Stuart Mill was a high-ranking official in the East India Company, which administered India until 1858. And he wrote the company's official defense, in which he recounted its achievements and defended his people's, quote, striving go-ahead character as the foundation of the best hopes for the general improvement of mankind. The historian John Kay, who had also served in India, succeeded Mill in the new India office that took over Indian governance from the East India Company and began to produce a mammoth history of the rebellion, the first volume appearing in 1864. This text acknowledged British terror, massacre, and expropriation, but in language that recalls Mill's language, it defended British, quote, errors and excesses as the result of strivings after good, the overeager pursuit of humanity and civilization. The rebellion was, quote, the most signal illustration of our great national character ever yet recorded, the fruit of overzealous British efforts to make history, but its successful quelling also validated that presumption to make history. So he writes, it was the vehement self-assertion of the Englishman that produced this conflagration. The same vehement self-assertion enabled him by God's blessing to trample it out. It was a noble egotism. So to be English was to be a maker of history, at times tragically, but ultimately in a manner vindicated by history itself. So gesturing to Carlyle, Kay saw India as the proving ground of great Englishmen. So he writes here, if it be true that the best history is that which most nearly resembles a bundle of biographies, that's a gesture to Carlyle, it is especially true that when said with reference to Indian history. For nowhere do the characters of individual Englishmen impress themselves with more vital reality upon the annals of the country in which they live. Nowhere are there such great opportunities of independent action. Nowhere are developed such capacities for good or evil as in our great Anglo-Indian empire. So historians were also the bureaucrats in charge, like Kay, right? And they made the empire resilient in the face of rebellion by its subjects and internal doubt about its violent and expropriatory practices. Historical writing, in other words, helped paper over the cracks in British conscience after 1858 and helped reinvest Britons in the idea of future vindication. Indians had rebelled, they thought, because they lacked the kind of disciplined conscience necessary for progress, the ability to endure temporary discomfort for a benevolent end, what Priestling had advocated. Clearly, they were radically different as human beings. If they willfully rejected pursuit of their own best interests, they might never become British. The idea of a permanent cultural and racial difference between Britons and their subjects now infused post-1858 imperialism as new theories of biological evolution added a gloss of scientific validation to that thinking. So the vengeance for 1857 showed Indians that it was, quote, hopeless to endeavor to resist the power of the white man. This is what Kay wrote in the same book. So British moral justifications of empire after 1857 were less about redeeming the scandals of 18th century conquest and more about protecting India and the rest of the world from the anarchy of such a backward society set loose from the imperial order. So they were securing India as a service to the world, a kind of necessary lesser evil. So history really offered them no other choice. This is what the jurist and historian Henry Maine made clear, and he's pictured here in this image. Now, Henry Maine was a historian and jurist who went to India after the rebellion, determined to end the process of Anglicization that Indians had so obviously clearly rejected. But once he got there, he changed his mind. He concluded that there was no alternative than to, quote, abide by actual arrangements, whether founded or not on an original misconstruction of native usage. I say, let us stand even by our mistakes. It is better than perpetual meddling. So a historical sensibility here is shaping Maine's sense of constrained scope for action. Some British officials at this time who were in India were saying, let's undo the damage we've caused. Let's reconstruct Indian society. But Maine says that such schemes are, quote, not practicable given the historical force of British power. He writes, it is by its indirect and for the most part unintended influence that the British power metamorphoses and dissolves the ideas and social reforms underneath it, nor is there any expedient by which it can escape the duty of rebuilding upon its own principles that which it unwillingly destroys. So the words unintended and unwillingly signal here that the empire was a kind of, to Maine, a kind of helpless historical force of its own, whose abstruse influence was impossible to resist as it did what it was destined to do. The idea that post-1857 British officials were trapped by the ongoing evolution of empire helped ease their clearly agitated consciences that were calling on them to actually try to do something else. So that's how they dealt with that conscience. So were they actually powerless to affect change? We'll never know. The point is that it was unthinkable in the historical imagination of those in charge to try something different. So Maine was deferring to systemic constraints on his ability to affect change. He saw historical necessity as a legitimate purpose for which to set aside his genuine, avowed ethical commitments, and he was counting on vindication by the judgment of time in doing so. Now, histories of the 1857 rebellion that emerged in the 1880s banished any lingering doubt or defensiveness about British actions and exonerated the British entirely from any taint of ruthlessness or excessive retaliation. But in other quarters, the rebellion started to emerge as a key site for remaking the historical discipline's ethical outlook. Even as the rebellion unfolded, you can see that happening. Some found their presumptions about history just undone. So Marx and Engels, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, were in London during the rebellion. And their socialist vision of history, like Macaulay's liberal vision, presumed a universal process that's unfolding in a linear direction, inexorably, progressively, right? And in a liberatory direction, but just in their case, it's driven by class conflict and heading towards a utopia of proletarian control. They too, though, assume that Europe is at the helm of this universal history and that imperialism was helping every region of the world go through the kind of required stages of, first bourgeois revolution and nationhood, and eventually to get to a state of international proletarian utopia. So Marx believed that England had, quote, a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating, the annihilation of the Asiatic society and the laying of the material foundations of Western society in Asia. So he knew that this, quote, progress would entail misery and degradation. He acknowledged that, but like liberal philosophers in this period, like someone like Macaulay, for instance, he advised tolerance and patience in the name of progress because England was, quote, the unconscious tool of history. Now, he was reporting on the 1857 rebellion. So these were his ideas before the rebellion. The rebellion happens in 1857. He and Engels start writing about it for the New York Daily Tribune. And they write articles as it's unfolding. And in these articles, they wind up questioning all their assumptions about these stages of history. They started to perceive that the British were actually disrupting rather than catalyzing Indian nationhood. So they write that through a, quote, Roman divide et impera, divide and rule, the British were trying to stoke, quote, the antagonism of the various races, tribes, castes, creeds, and sovereignties in India in order to fortify their own supremacy. And that now, in the rebellion, those different groups had joined in common cause. They called out the cruel practices that the British had justified in the name of progress, like the use of torture and tax collection. And they strove to unveil, quote, the real history of British rule in India, including the fact that Britain actually derived significant material benefits from it. They insisted on the justice of Indian efforts to expel their abusive foreign conquerors and defended the violence of the rebels. They wrote, quote, however infamous the conduct of the rebels, it is only the reflex of England's own conduct in India. Instead of characterizing the Indian rebels as irrationally, fanatically refusing progress, Marx compared them to the revolutionaries of France. And so then casting them as the bearers of progress instead. So Marx and Engels refused to join the, quote, when the rebellion was ending and the British were prevailing, they said, we refuse to join the noisy chorus extolling the bravery of the English troops that took Delhi by storm. And they kind of mocked the British capacity for, quote, self-laudation. In other words, the self-serving way in which the British, they could see, were habitually narrating their history. So Marx and Engels perceived that a particular historical outlook had become complicit in a morally dubious way of acting in the world. Marx was certain that far from being redeemed in the future, these, quote, treacherous and brutal modes of proceeding toward the natives of India would avenge themselves not only in India, but in England. So despite Marxism's theoretical faith in European imperialism's progressive role, Marx himself, in the moment, supported rebellion against imperialism. He was certain of the rebels' moral rightness, regardless of whether history in the end judged them right, because after all, the Indians lost. History judged them wrong in that sense. Now, Marx and Engels were not alone in sort of mutinying against dominant historical thinking. Their friend Ernest Jones, who was a kind of romantic poet, novelist, and the leader of the very popular Chartist movement for working class suffrage in Britain, saw the mutiny saw the Indian Rebellion as a potential spur to working class rebellion in Britain. Richard Congreve was a positivist, which was a philosophy based on transcendent belief in the unity of humanity, and he judged the British victory over the rebels as a triumph of force over right. So he also sympathized with the rebels. In India, Syed Ahmad Khan emerged as a major Muslim reformer while writing the first Indian historical account of the rebellion in 1859. Now, the British executed the editor of the Indian newspaper I quoted from earlier, the Delhi Urdu Akhbar. They killed the editor, but the editor's son also became a historian. So there's a pattern here. So despite failure, the rebellion made a kind of crack in history itself. It would inspire future rebellions against the British and also furnish a primary historical terrain upon which historians would try to redeem historical thinking in the 20th century. So rebels from 1857 scattered around the world to escape British retribution and influenced anti-colonial rebellion elsewhere. Irish nationalists, for instance, were inspired, and you see the launch of the Fenian movement. The Egyptian revolt of 1882 also bore the imprint of 1857. Within India, using various tactics to prevent South Asians from ever combining into a bloc against their rule again, the British triggered fresh rebellion that built on the memory of 1857. So in 1905, they divided the province of Bengal in East India on religious lines, explicitly to stifle anti-colonial sentiment that was growing there. And the Bengalis rebelled against this, and they drew strength from the fact that it happened to be in 1907, it was the 50th anniversary of 1857. So the British were commemorating this anniversary in 1907, and in response to that, the Hindu nationalist V.D. Savarkar published a revisionist history of the rebellion, describing it instead as a kind of nationalist uprising. And he wrote this book while he was in London, and he was reading histories of the French Revolution and the American Revolution and casting 1857 in those terms. And in the face that, the British tried really hard to ban this book. So Savarkar had to have it printed in the Netherlands. And so it got delayed and came out 2 years later in 1909. And it became a much read, banned book in India. Now, some rebels of 1857 also came to California. And in 1913, their descendants founded a party called the Ghadar Party. You can see these are just Punjabi people in 1910, so early generations of immigrants. So they founded a party called the Ghadar Party, named after the mutiny, which was an organization for international revolution against the British Empire. And the name was an homage to 1857. So many Ghadar Party members went to India during the First World War in 1915 to launch an armed rebellion to free India. But the American intelligence agencies helped the British capture them when they landed, and so they were hanged and imprisoned, just like the rebels of 1857. The editor, and so here is a handbill showing, as it says at the bottom there, the above are among the 400 who have been hanged during 1915 and 1916, the martyrs of the Ghadar Party, who went to go free, from California to go free India. Now, the Ghadar Party had its own magazine, printed in different scripts here. And the editor of this magazine, this was all printed in California. The editor was a man named Muhammad Barkatullah Bhopali, and he became the prime minister of the Provisional Government of India, which was this exile government of anti-colonial Indians that they established in Kabul, in present-day Afghanistan, during the First World War. And the president of the provisional government, pictured here, was called Raja Mahendra Pratap. And he also met with Ghadar members after the war, with those Californian anti-colonial descendants. So many of these wartime activists from the provisional government of India later led this post-war movement called the Khilafat movement, which was a movement to save the caliphate, the Turkish caliphate, from abolition, because the First World War caused the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, which was also the caliphate. The Sultan was also caliphate. So there was the kind of transnational movement to stop that, in which the Congress Party and the Muslim League in India cooperated. It was a big Gandhian movement too. Now, instead of the historical imagination of empire and nation, leaders of this movement embraced a more expansive understanding of freedom as something beyond the political freedoms guaranteed by the state. Rather than an ethics of ends justifying the means, this understanding collapsed ends and means. So freedom lay in the creation of networks of people struggling towards the common end of freedom. So it's not when you get to freedom that you have freedom, but it's in the struggle towards freedom that's where you experience freedom. This was an ethics because you're doing it together. So this was an ethics of connection as a means and end, akin to that 1857 ideal of coexistence with the alien that derived partly from the memory of the Constitution of Medina. Now, Medina was the city to which the Prophet Muhammad had fled from Mecca for refuge, where Muslims and non-Muslims famously came together to form a single community or ummah. That's the constitution of Medina. That was kind of the religious historical model. So this was an ethical outlook that could not be captured by Western historicism's linearity, right? And this is where past, present, and future are sort of collapsed into one. They're at the same time. Now, Gandhi also disavowed, let me just check my time here, disavowed the narrative of progress that justified imperialism. He said that the future of India lies in its villages. And he turned that Orientalist notion of timeless India, the lack of a historical sense among Indians on its head. And he rejected the idea of unidirectional linear time heading inexorably towards a universal vision of modernity. In holding up villages instead as an ideal. And he was fascinated by the Gita, which is a certain section of the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, which is a kind of explicitly, it's a guide to ethical agency, right? And he was fascinated by that text, partly because he was actively searching for an alternative ethical guide to action as part of his rejection of Western thinking, Western education, in favor, Macaulayite thinking, in favor of what he called religious or ethical education. He really felt that by leaving judgment to history, Western thinking, had made humans ethically unaccountable in the present. And so Gandhian nonviolence was calling on humans to be morally accountable in the present, rather than engage in violence or any kind of morally dubious act out of the expectation of some future vindication, right? When it's unethical, it's unethical. It can't be vindicated in the future. Now, from the 1930s, anti-colonial poets of India's progressive writers movement also looked to 1857, that rebellion, because in that rebellion too, poets had figured very prominently, because poets had a central role in Mughal courtly culture. The Emperor Zafar, who I showed you earlier, was actually a very prominent poet himself. And some of the Indian progressive writers movement poets of the 1930s were anti-colonial activists, were actually direct descendants of leaders of the 1857 rebellion. And many actively challenged the historical narratives that justified imperialism as a kind of incubator of the nation, and adopted a broader and more transcendent notion of freedom as something, again, that's realized in the course of struggle towards it. Now, the ethical purpose of writing history in Britain and Europe itself changed under all this pressure from anti-colonial thought. And that was also because of the way the world wars in the 20th century started to cast doubt on the assumption that history is going to be a narrative of progress. So, and here too, 1857 was pivotal. So this is Edward Thompson, who was a missionary in India, who became suspicious of received historical wisdom about the empire and the historical purpose it served during the First World War. And in that war, he accompanied the British invasion of Iraq as an army chaplain. And after his disillusionment in that war, he resolved, he said, to quote, I'm going to stand finally and without question with the rebels, because Western civilization is bankrupt. Now, he became a close friend of Gandhi and other Indian anti-colonial leaders. He resigned from his mission and he became a historian. He began to rewrite the history of British imperialism in India as penance for his earlier complicity in it. And he began with a revisionist account of the 1857 rebellion. And he told his friend Tagore, the anti-colonial poet Rabindranath Tagore, that he was writing this book as, quote, an individual Englishman's act of atonement. And the book, which was called The Other Side of the Medal, came out in 1925, and it acknowledged at last, from a British perspective, the Indian rebels' genuine political protest and the fact that British violence had provoked the rebels' violence. And he recognized that means that the power of myths, of British myths about 1857 in sustaining the empire since then. Now, Edward Thompson's revolutionary approach to history writing was shaped by Britain's proactive new post-war mass democracy. which really aimed at checking the state's attempts to pursue covert imperial agendas that did not have the public support. So he articulated a vision of history writing as active citizenship. He said, quote, "Now the historian cannot be historian only." To him, the historian's craft was the most effective means of truth-telling against the imperial state. So history writing, rather than history, would bring redemption. Now, anti-colonial historians in the colonies and in Britain opened the imperial record to fresh questioning, fresh narrativization, recognizing that claims about history's ethical uses had long served to cover up its political uses. Thompson wrote, quote, "Our writing of India's history is perhaps resented more than anything else we have done." His son was E.P. Thompson. Now, E.P. Thompson's turn to, who's sort of the father, thought of as a father of history from below in Britain, social history in Britain. Now, E.P. Thompson's turn to history from below in the late 1950s built on his father's work. He was trying to combat the British state's imperiousness at home during the Cold War, and he found inspiration in the historic libertarian tradition of the English working class. He never wrote about, Indian history. He was writing about English working class people. And he highlighted the power of collective action over great man history to redeem forgotten historical actors, but also to alter the ethical premises of political action in his own time, to inspire truly democratic pushback against the top-down Soviet left and Britain's imperial state. And this meant assembling a different historical imagination, free of the idea of the judgment of time and the presumption of progress. So he writes in his famous book, The Making of the English Working Class, "Our only criterion for judgment should not be whether or not a man's actions are justified in the light of subsequent evolution." This is the opposite of what Priestling and Kant and everybody said in the 18th century. He instead sought ethical inspiration from lost causes, things that have failed and not been redeemed by the passage of time, rather than seeking inspiration from events that may have been vindicated by history, but whose ethical merit was not otherwise readily apparent. Like, just because the victors were the victors doesn't mean they were in the right. Of course, the origins of history from below are much more complicated than this. It's not all about E.P. Thompson. I'm really bracketing here the whole story of, all the continental thinkers who contribute to this. And my purpose is just to highlight, and trace a direct line from the historical vision of the rebels of 1857 in India and the ethical orientation of history writing as we know it today, how that 19th century Victorian conflict is very much still with us and shaping how we think about history. Now, the late 20th century revolution in historical sensibility changed how and why academic historians went about their work. But a lot of popular history continued from, even to our own time in the old groove of great man history, hero worship, triumphalist narratives of the West, triumphalist narratives of the British Empire. Even E.P. Thompson did not let go of the idea that the study of history offered insights into the problem of evils in the world, and he remained committed to the idea of progress insofar as he imagined a cure sometime in the future. You can see that in the rest of this quote here. So he's rummaging through lost causes, partly as an end in itself, but also for pragmatic and instrumental reasons, hoping to further progress in this history in his own time. And I think, to conclude here, that continued cultural investment in the idea of deferring judgment to time is an important reason why the moral case against empire seems to remain ambivalent. It actually isn't. Why many people continue to debate the pros and cons of British rule as if it was anything but an illegitimate and immoral form of rule. So thank you so much for listening. I know it's not the easiest thing on Zoom, and thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Priya. It's very interesting to me that so much of the narrative of the development of modern historiography is anchored in Eurocentric developments, and specifically in the French revolutions of 1789 and 1848, and to completely alter our perspective by focusing on the events of 1857, I think is really instructive. So thank you so much for that. This is in part clearly a story of different historiographical traditions or different ways of historical thinking. And I wonder whether you could say a few more words about the way in which Indian or South Asian historical consciousness had developed in the years before 1857. What are the media through which it's expressed? Is it oral history? Is it written history? Is it based in institutions of any kind? And while you're thinking about an answer to that, let me encourage our audience to submit further questions through the Q&A if they have them.
Sure. Oh, that's a great question. Because I'm not really a South Asian historian, and I'm sort of interloping and taking advantage of some native language skill. I can't speak expertly about the history of Indian history writing. I do know just from secondary literature, and I encourage you, there's a recent book, Manan Ahmed's book, The Loss of Hindustan, that is about this. But there were Mughal historians, people who were keeping records in written form of the whole British incursion, commenting on it, their critical, analytical histories of that. So they're courtly historians for sure. Of course, there are oral traditions, and of course there is a whole other mode of history writing that mixes myth and history together. Which is some of which this newspaper was referring to. It was also kind of concatenating all those different forms of history and saying, take your inspiration from where you will, whether it's Mughal history, whether it's the Mahabharata, they're all kind of forms of history, and they're all legitimate sources of inspiration. So all these there are multiple modes, I would say. And you see them also expanding. So the editor of that newspaper actually attended the Delhi College, which had been influenced by the British. So he also had exposure to kind of British modes of historical thinking too. So there's also mutual influence going on. You have to remember that insofar as the foundations of European historical thought can be traced to somebody like Herodotus or Thucydides. I mean, those are figures who are, Mediterranean thinkers whose influence went as far east as it went west. So, there are Asian traditions in history that you can even trace back to them as well. So that would be my guess. But okay. Yeah.
Thank you. So Stan Farrar has an interesting question about the inability of the British to learn any lessons from history, specifically in the analogy between the response to the 1919 Amritsar massacre and the 1857 mutiny. Would you like to expand on the parallels between the British narrative after 1857 and the whitewash after Amritsar?
Yeah, I think there was a lot more. So there were qualms after 1857 too, but they were sort of more readily suppressed. So I mentioned like John Stuart Mill just defended the company. 10 years later, though, when the Fenian movement was happening in the context of conversations about Irish rebellion, he changed his tune, and he both privately and publicly said, we behaved terribly against Indians in 1857. So I'm not sure if he was, because of his official capacity, covering that up in 1858 and sitting on that, or was it because he starts to see a pattern, because there's also this rebellion in Jamaica in 1865, and he becomes sort of very central to the moral controversy around that. I think he starts maybe to see a pattern and look back again at 1857 and think, well, that was not an exception. We are again and again behaving like tyrants. So there are people who are critical all along and have doubts. And you see that in 1919 as well. Even someone as unapologetic about empire as Churchill says, wow, this is a terrible thing. But he says, this is an exception to our general practice. So it's because of the way history has been written about 1857 and 1865 and all the other rebellions that each time it happens, people can make the claim that, oh, this is the exception. We've never done this before. So that is a recurring pattern. And that, I think, and you see how quickly the histories start to appear after each controversy, because there's a kind of cultural awareness of how powerful a historical narrative can be in sort of shutting down moral qualms and assuaging them and helping people live with their knowledge of the violence that had been resorted to. And that has this long-term kind of cascading effect. And so maybe it's because of that recurring pattern that they're never able to see imperialism in its full light over time as having been consistently tyrannical and violent, rather than mostly benevolent with an occasional hiccup, which is, I think, the preferred narrative, even today, among many constituencies.
Interesting. There's a really great question here about the response in British print immediately after 1857, and speculating whether there's a sense in which the British try and provide a picture that there can be no further Indian history to occur after 1857, publishing educational maps of India up to the Battle of Plassey, but no further than that. It's almost as if Indian history has come to an end with the suppression of the mutiny.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as the mutiny kind of makes Britons more pessimistic about the liberal narrative. Like before 1857, they thought anyone can become British, and we're shepherding Indians into becoming British, and they're going to have the same civilization as us because that's what civilization means. And then the rebellion happens, the crushing of it, and then now they think, oh, wait a minute, there's major racial and cultural barriers. They're never going to become Britons, and so as they're in local parentis, the best thing we can do is sort of preserve things and not change them too much. And anthropology becomes a much more important lens for understanding Indian society than history. And, let's study and classify all the different regions, castes, religions, and sort of ossify Indian society and keep it as a snapshot of whatever it is in 1858, and keep the princely parts of India instead of annexing them, the little pieces of India that they had not yet annexed, as you remember that map. When they have opportunities to annex them after 1857, they don't annex them outright. They allow the local ruler to continue to rule as a puppet of the British. And again, there's a sense of Indians only want to see their old hereditary rulers in charge, and we will be behind the scenes, and this kind of museum approach to India. And that it is going to be timeless, it's incapable of change, and we're just here to manage it so it doesn't create anarchy, because that's what's going to happen if we're not here. So there is that kind of different tone and moral justification before and after 1857.
Interesting. There's a number of questions coming in that overlap and intersect on the question of the historian's obligation to judge or not to judge history. So I'm wondering whether you can expand a little bit on your own philosophy of history, your own motivation for becoming a historian, and how you feel about the historian's obligation to suspend moral judgment or to offer moral judgment.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I really don't think it's helpful to judge. I mean, I'm not muted. Okay, you can't sort of a journalist. Sometimes there are these gripping kind of more journalistic works on history in which it's almost like a crime scene, and you go back and you need judgment for that kind of work, and that's its own genre and that has its own importance. But insofar as we're trying to understand what it is to be human, judgment just gets in the way. I mean, we all like to think that if we lived in the past, we would have been on the moral one, like we would not have been the Nazis, right? But statistically, we would have been. So it's more helpful to not judge and understand, okay, how did people become Nazis, or how did Britons support the violence of 1858, than to say, wow, look what they did. Those people, we would never do that. I mean, that if you come at it from that perspective, you're not gonna understand that essential human capacity to be like that, which is as much our capacity as it was theirs, right? Given the right circumstances and opportunity, we may do the same, right?
Interesting. So there's a question here from Padma Jagannathan about why British contemporary historians are so reluctant to tell the story that you've offered us from the Mughal or Indian perspective. Besides William Dalrymple, can't really think of many examples of British historians trying to do that. So why is British historians so reluctant to reckon with their imperial past in this way, do you think?
Well, I think actually, I mean, there's this weird divide. Like, I mean, it's like, why don't popular historians do it? Because I feel like there's a lot of agreement among scholarly historians. Mm-hmm. And, you know, William Dalrymple is one popular historian who kind of stands out. And I guess there just also aren't too many very, very popular historians who write about empire. And I think that's shifting right now. There are more trade books that are emerging that do give a more critical narrative. I mean, my book that came out in the fall is with Penguin Alan Lane. I'm not sure if I've mastered the mode of popular writing, right. And you know, it's a craft of storytelling. But I mean, I do feel, and there's Empire Land by Satnam Sanghera, which came out I think earlier this year. So there are more that are coming out that are popular and that challenge what we've had until I think this decade, which has been a much less critical view, even while in academic history, there's been a very critical view. Right. And so I think that's because we continue to live in an imperial era. Like all this, that time has been the time of the Cold War, the War on Terror, which really extended the liberal values that underwrote imperialism, right? I mean, the United States was against the British Empire until they were more against the Soviet Empire. Right. And then they actually preferred to preserve the reasoning of the British, that justified the British Empire and apply it themselves, right? Like we are watching over Latin America as caretakers, you know, in that babysitting capacity, the same way that the British or French did in the 19th century in other parts of the world. So you kind of see an extension of that way of thinking, and then the War on Terror too. And so it's with the fading of those things that I think long delayed critical views are finally able to get oxygen, get published, find audiences, and the diversification of the discipline has helped too. More people of color, more women.
I would certainly agree with that. I think my answer to that question would be that there are changes in the high school history curriculum and changes in the undergraduate curriculum have been very slow in coming in the United Kingdom. And it's only very recently that serious academic study has been addressed to the kind of questions that you are asking. We've got time, I think, for just a couple more questions before we close. One of our audience members says that what you're describing about England and India could easily be translated to America and Native Americans, or America and the Philippines, or America and any number of other countries or groups. Were there American analogues to the kind of historians that you are describing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the first place, in the beginning, the Enlightenment culture is a transatlantic culture. And I gave you that example of Washington and Hamilton from the musical, but this is really the thinking of the founders, right? They were Enlightenment thinkers and activists. So the same philosophical seeds are there in, you know, the new United States from the beginning. That's one thing. Number two, the British example is so powerful and so paradigmatic that as, you know, as it is expanding and doing what it does, the Americans are watching and they want to emulate it. I mean, Kipling writes The White Man's Burden, and it's addressed to Americans because of what they're doing in the Philippines, right? So there's a, you know, student-teacher relationship going on there that's very explicit. So that's number two. And number three, yes, absolutely, with the, like an idea like manifest destiny, it is very similar to this providential idea of history. So there are, you know, just sort of, you know, American echoes. I also think the French, you know, civilizing mission idea is also very influential in America too. So I think there are, although the European example is so instructive, there's a lot of deliberate copying, and there's also the reality of, you know, them coming from a similar philosophical place and having similar providential notions. I mean, the same kind of Protestant ideas are well rooted in the United States too. So yes, they are similar. They're going to be different particularities, but I think, yeah, you can definitely find similarities and parallels.
Terrific, thank you. So we'll conclude with a question from Zoat Chowdhury. Hi Zoat, hope you're doing well. Glad that you're in the audience. She's interested in your attention to the word rebellion, especially given the context of 1857. But she wants to ask if revolution is also a useful term in your work for the British interventions in India, given that as early as the 1750s, revolution is a term used to describe company interventions in Bengal.
Oh, so whether the 1857 rebellion could be called a revolution?
Yeah, I think that's the implication of the question, or the relevance of the term revolution to this context in the mid-19th century. Forgive me if I'm wrong, Zola.
Yeah, so the word revolution is revolutionized in the late 18th century, right? And I write about that in my book, from which this talk is taken, Time's Monster. And so it is about, making a kind of clean break with the past. It's very intentional. It's like, we are going to make history and make something new now. And I don't know if, I guess a South Asian historian would be the right person to ask about whether rebels in 1857 were doing that. I think there's too much of a mixture in the ideas, where some people are trying to, in a conservative sense, restore old structures of governance. So that's not revolutionary, right? But some are actually, some of the peasants involved and stuff are rebelling as much against the kind of capitalist imperialism of their time, and the old and hereditary rulers too, and they're attacking moneylenders as well as the British, right? So you could argue that there is a revolutionary intent and ethos there, but I don't, altogether overall, I don't know if the word revolution would be appropriate, but certainly for segments of these groups of rebels, I think it would be entirely appropriate. And definitely the way Marx and Engels are looking at it, they are seeing it in the mold of like revolution as in the French Revolution.
Yes.
So it's an interpretive move you can make, right? And all of these words are interpretive moves. That's why I think the mutiny has this way of shrinking it, just like the word hill station shrinks the Himalayas, the biggest mountains in the world, into little hills. These are rhetorical moves that aggrandize, the British.
These things get euphemized, don't they? I always think of the terminology for what happens in Northern Ireland, the Troubles. It's a long-standing tradition. Yeah.
If it wasn't so painful, it would be very funny, Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
The Troubles.
So on that note, we will conclude. I'd like to thank you, Priya, for battling through the talk despite your obvious cold. You've done.
I'm sorry about all the sound effects. I'm sorry. Thank you all for bearing with me.
And thank you to our audience for staying with us and for asking such excellent questions. We do get a Q&A report at the end of these Zoom sessions, and I will make sure to share that with Priya in case she wants to follow up with anybody who asks a question that she would like to answer. But once again, thank you, Priya. Happy birthday. Thank you, Kathleen. Happy birthday. And please stay safe, everybody, and look forward to happier times ahead. Thank you for being with us. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.